Good afternoon. I'm Jane Campbell. I'm the president and CEO of the United States Capitol Historical Society. We are the congressionally chartered nonprofit organization dedicated to telling the story of the Capitol and the people who work in a manner that inspires informed patriotism. When we were chartered by Congress in 1962, it was the time when the White House Historical Society came into being, and you can imagine that our founder, Congressman Fred Schwengel, said, "We're Article 1 of the Constitution. We better tell our story just as much as the White House." And from that moment on, we have been sharing and partnering up with the White House Historical Society and the Supreme Court Historical Society as we talk about the importance of the work that goes on in Washington, D.C. The United States Capitol is our symbol of democracy. And in these hallowed halls, critical activities go on. So we are dedicated to telling the stories of the work there and the implications, not just for the time it happened, but for what's going on today. It's been said often that history doesn't repeat itself, but there is a rhyme involved. So today we are here with a distinguished speaker to talk about the parallels in United States history in the wake of the Industrial Revolution with author Nancy Unger. This highly illustrated talk will demonstrate that there are a surprising number of instructive similarities between the long Gilded Age and the Progressive Era that went from 1877 to 1920 and our own times. These range from business people who claimed that their wealth and acumen entitled them to enormous political power. There were controversial actions and debates about civil service reform, immigration, sexuality, race, the role of women, vaccines, and public health. And it concludes with a reminder of the importance and the power of civic engagement. Nancy Unger, let me tell you about our speaker. She is an award-winning author and teacher who believes the study of history is not only fun, but vital to our understanding of the present and can be a powerful tool in solving today's problems. She is a professor of history at Santa Clara University, just about to retire and take her next adventure, which we're all excited to see what that book is going to be about. And those lectures that will be going on, we're honored that she chose us as one of her first posting in that, next generation activities. As we were talking beforehand, she said, "I gave my last final." But she hasn't graded them yet, so be careful. There's still a little bit more to go. The New York Times said of her first book, the award-winning Fighting Bob La Follette, the righteous reformer, they quoted, "La Follette leaps from the pages. Her op-eds, syndicated by History News Service, have appeared in newspapers across the country. Chicago, Miami, San Francisco, Kansas City. Her radio appearances include National Public Radio, Talking History, Air America, and she even consulted with Bill Moyers for PBS. She is particularly proud of the cover image of her book, Beyond Nature's Housekeepers, because it's her mother-in-law at age 16 at a ranch camp in Arizona in 1946. In researching her latest book, Belle La Follette, the Progressive Era reformer, she was surprised to find that La Follette was far more radical than her self-effacing demeanor suggested. Called disgraceful to the white race, La Follette was fierce and fearless in her pursuit of equality, peace, and votes for women. It is my honor now to present to you Dr. Nancy Unger to walk us through the Progressive Era, the Gilded Age, and what might we learn. Take it away.
Well, goodness, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. All right. So Good afternoon. I am just delighted.
Nancy, put it on the
Yes.
slideshow. You're still showing the next slide.
Oh dear. Uh, how
There,
is that?
perfect. That's it.
That's
That's
what we need?
perfect. That's
Great.
perfect. Yep.
Thank you so much for that correction. All right, here we go. So I am delighted to be presenting to the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. As you can see from this first cartoon, very wealthy business leaders whose power is so great that they view the American government as an amusing plaything are nothing new. In this case, it's John D. Rockefeller, founder of Standard Oil, saying, "What a funny little government." And Elon Musk is not the first businessman to claim that wealth and business acumen entitles him to enormous political power. According to the spokesman for the coal mine owners during the anthracite coal strike of 1902, quote, "The rights and interests of the laboring man will be protected and cared for, not by the labor agitators, but by the Christian men of property to whom God has given control of the property rights of the country, and upon the successful management of which so much depends." And here's another quick parallel. This cartoon is from last month. The executive branch severs the other two branches. More than 100 years ago, President Theodore Roosevelt was lampooned for claiming that the executive branch could do anything not specifically forbidden, thereby dwarfing the little Constitution there in the foreground. And in view of Donald Trump's tariffs agenda, I thought you might appreciate this 1890 protection pig striding into Congress, demanding, quote, "a prohibitory tariff on all imports in the interests of the suffering laborer and the struggling industries." And here are the results, as protected interests, but not the consumer, reap the benefits. I've devoted my life to the study of history because to me it's a very practical subject. When faced with difficult problems in troubled times, why reinvent the wheel? Why not see how people attacked similar problems in the past? What worked? What didn't work? I study the progressives, a group of political and social reformers very active at the turn of the 19th century. The progressives were scrambling to tackle the then brand new problems of an urban industrial society. Things that worked for them under those conditions may not apply to 2025. But I do think it's important to look at the number and degree of the problems they faced that seemed insurmountable and see what they weren't and what they were able to achieve. Fighting Bob La Follette and his wife, Belle La Follette, were some of the leading lights in that original progressive movement. Bill Moyer said of my biography of Bob La Follette, "The ideas of La Follette and his fellow progressives are our best hope for countering the reactionary and destructive forces that threaten to dissolve this fragile experiment in self-government, which has so much to offer and has so far yet to go." So what were those ideas? And what can we learn from this unassuming little couple from Wisconsin? Let's start with Robert La Follette. He was born in the proverbial log cabin in 1855. He attended the University of Wisconsin for both undergrad and law. He served as U.S. Representative from 1885 to 1891, governor from 1901 to 1906, and in the U.S. Senate from 1906 until his death in 1925. So lesson one. If you want to create real solutions to political problems, first understand their causes. In 1873, just before becoming a college student, young Bob La Follette heard Edward Ryan, soon to be Wisconsin's Chief Justice, give a commencement speech. Ryan placed the central questions of the coming era in the simplest of terms. Quote, "Which shall rule, wealth or man? Which shall lead, money or intellect? Who shall fill public stations? Educated and patriotic freemen, or the feudal serfs of corporate capital? La Follette found his opportunity to answer those questions within the progressive movement, which rose in response to conditions of the long Gilded Age and Progressive era, from roughly the end of Reconstruction to the end of World War I. See if any of this sounds familiar in today's America. The gilt or gold plating of that remarkable period was glittering indeed. It's perhaps best represented by the fantastic lifestyles of the rich and famous who made enormous profits providing steel, oil, meat, beer, timber, and all the other raw materials, manufactured goods, and services vital to a burgeoning nation. But beneath this dazzling exterior, chock-a-block with such modern marvels as streetcars, telephones, electric lights, and inexpensive manufactured goods, darkness lurked. Again, look for similarities today. The economy was unregulated, unstable at best, frequently rocked by recessions and depressions. Immigrants poured in, providing much of the labor force for industrialized America. Dreams of the United States as a welcoming land of glorious opportunity, however, seem to be realized exclusively by the already wealthy, who pulled the ladder up after themselves rather than allow others to ascend. What remained were menial, often dangerous jobs so low paying that frequently the labor of the entire family was necessary for survival, either in the workplace or manufacturing at home for a fraction of a cent per piece. After long hours in dangerous conditions, workers returned to urban ghettos rife with poverty, crime, and disease. Yes, those children are playing in the street next to a dead horse. Today, many long-term goals of the Environmental Protection Agency are being reversed. Then, precious non-renewable resources were decimated with no thought to their conservation, let alone preservation. Here we see a mountain of buffalo skulls. Their bodies had been left to rot. This charts the rapid depletion of the nation's forests. And on the social side, there was panic then as now about people turning away from fundamentalist Christianity and about women who were not finding total fulfillment as wives and mothers and selfishly and foolishly seeking it outside the domestic sphere. So where was the government in all of this? Too often, government appeared at best helpless to curb the harmful excesses, at worst a willing collaborator in the profitable carnage. Here are the real bosses of the Senate, these enormous money bags that represent the various trusts. And while the monopolist entrance on the far right is wide open, you can see that the people's entrance has been closed. People who think we live in a time of unparalleled greed and corruption should take a close look at the Gilded Age, when politicians like New York's Boss Plunkett spoke openly and approvingly of honest graft, and when a seat in Congress, known as the Millionaires Club, could be purchased merely to increase a wealthy man's status, and when U.S. senators were not elected by the people, but selected by state legislators, frequently through backroom bribes. The power of trust dwarfed the Capitol, as well as Uncle Sam, law, and justice. And the bag of money labeled "for lobbying" stuffed in his pocket shows how this is achieved. And the results? Well, you can see who's really in charge in Congress. And here, the monopoly monster with its tail wrapped around the Capitol is menacing liberty. And Uncle Sam is being asked, what are you going to do about it? Monsters with their tails wrapped around the Capitol is a popular theme. Railroads were some of the worst offenders. So here we see a brave farmer trying to beat back the monster. And some members of Congress tried as well. Here we see Uncle Sam's Wild West show, the interstate commerce commissioners are moving in on the bucking animals. Some Americans worried about the inevitable results if millionaires like Jay Gould and Cornelius Vanderbilt, shown here resting on their bags of millions, were allowed to continue to be upheld by labor at starvation wages. Note in the right foreground the hammer and sickle in the sea of hard times, suggesting the possibility of revolution. Here, wealth is living lavishly on the backs of the poor, who are breaking through and about to disrupt the lives of the elite. The possibility of revolution was real, and for some of the wealthy, it was all the more reason to keep the poor weak and powerless. The country, observed Bob La Follette early in his political career, was, quote, fast being dominated by hostile forces that thwart the will of the people and menace the perpetuity of representative government. Rather than wait for a possible rebellion, La Follette and his fellow progressive reformers were dedicated to combating all the various problems of the new urban industrial age, waging what amounted to a war over the future of the nation. He observed, "We have long rested comfortably in this country upon the assumption that because our form of government was democratic, it would therefore automatically produce democratic results. Tyranny and oppression are just as possible under democratic forms as under any other." La Follette's rallying cry emerged from his understanding of the core problem that sounds alarmingly familiar today. The supreme issue involving all the others is the encroachment of the powerful few upon the rights of the many. So lesson 2, translate your ideals and sweeping goals into practical, achievable solutions. Under Bob La Follette's leadership, Wisconsin pioneered many aspects of the fight to more equitably redistribute the nation's wealth and power. For example, Wisconsin boasted a thoroughgoing and efficient reform of railroads and other powerful utilities. Today, the Trump administration is reinstalling Schedule F, making tens of thousands of federal employees outside merit system principles, essentially turning federal jobs into appointments based on politics rather than merit. This reverses the civil service reforms La Follette instituted for state officials. His administration also regulated lobbyists, enacted stronger provisions against corrupt practices, environmental measures, including the Forest Conservation Program, tax reforms, and nominations by primary elections for all elected officials so they could no longer be purchased in backroom deals. As noted in the far right of this poster, sale of seats to the United States Senate has been prohibited. Before La Follette, Wisconsin, shown here in this poster, was being squeezed to death by the railroad monster. With La Follette, Wisconsin is a model state with a bow in its hair. By 1906, when La Follette took his agenda to the U.S. Senate, many of the state's reforms were eagerly adopted by progressive governors across the nation. Then, as now, immigrants flooding American shores were deemed a serious threat to the nation's white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Here, with the Vatican in the background, Catholic bishops wearing mitres that turn them into crocodiles are clearly coming for the Protestant American children on the shore. Other cartoons revealed the hypocrisy of such fears. Here, wealthy American businessmen turn away a young Irish immigrant. We see, however, the shadows of their former selves when they were young immigrants. But the idea that riff-raff immigration was a danger to American ideas and institutions persisted. Immigrants were presented as dangerous, pouring in. Here they are presented as rats, dumped, quote, direct from the slums of Europe daily. And in this cartoon, European garbage ships dump their cargoes. In my state of California, the Chinese were presented as the greatest threat. Here, San Francisco Bay features not the Statue of Liberty, welcoming earnest immigrants, but a Chinese man holding an opium pipe and radiating disease, immorality, filth, and ruin to white labor. This anti-immigrant sentiment culminated in the Geary Act of 1902, extending indefinitely the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Here, a dejected Chinese man who, despite his baggage of industry, peace, and sobriety, quote, is the only one, pardon me, barred out. Note on the sign on the left that communists, socialists, and hoodlums are still welcome. And by 1917, we see the Chinese weren't the only Asians whose immigration was halted. Other groups were targeted as well. Here we see the extremely anti-Semitic depiction of the Hebrew line, bringing a boatload of Jews in which even the fish in the sea, seen in the bottom left, and the boat itself conformed to negative stereotypes. And unlike the industrious Chinaman who was barred out, here we see a Jew carrying his baggage of Sabbath desecration, anarchy, disease, and poverty, able to walk right into the United States with its capital gleaming in the background, despite the obvious disapproval of Uncle Sam. Now, even among their fellow progressives, the La Follettes were unusual in their view of immigrants. They supported the perception of the US as not just an ark of refuge, but saw immigrants as potential assets to the nation rather than certain detriments. Let me introduce you briefly to Bob's wife, Belle, journalist, suffrage campaigner, and peace advocate, who was also the first woman to graduate from the University of Wisconsin Law School. Here she is with her graduating class. See if you can pick her out. One of my friends observes that she seems to be the only one who's earned a diploma. Belle La Follette stated plainly that different was not synonymous with inferior. Theodore Roosevelt welcomed immigrants only if they completely abandoned their previous identities and loyalties, stating emphatically, "In this country, we have no place for hyphenated Americans." Belle La Follette countered by asking whether immigrants, quote, with their older civilizations, do not bring some standards that it would be well for us to adopt rather than displace. She urged that instead of the assumption of superiority on our part and limitation on theirs, there should be greater mutual respect and teachability. The La Follettes and others welcomed both the cheap labor and cultural diversity provided by immigrants. They were outshouted by those who wanted to block the pipe, dumping immigrants from the, quote, trouble holes of Europe, the Gilded Age version of shithole countries. In the 1920s, a quota system put the menace of modern migration to a stop, serving notice to Europe that the US was not a dumping ground. Is there anything positive to be learned from this time that demanded the curtailment of immigration? Well, yes. Sometimes the courts do actually defy undemocratic trends. This is Wing Kim Ark, born in California, but denied re-entry after a trip to China. When his lawsuit reached the Supreme Court, even in this time of racism and ethnocentrism, the 1898 ruling confirmed his citizenship, a constitutional right that has been recognized ever since, but is being challenged today by Donald Trump. Trump is also doing his damnedest to roll back decades of progress and expanding opportunities for people of color, women, and other historically marginalized groups. Certainly, the present administration's insistence that there is only a binary when it comes to sexuality, and the efforts to vilify those who don't conform as weak, unpatriotic, and un-American is nothing new. Once the war broke out in Europe, the Great War, World War I, former President Theodore Roosevelt, depicted here as a warrior with his spear and shield, demanded that the United States launch a huge military preparedness campaign. An extremely effeminate, limp-wristed Uncle Sam is saying, "Theodore, if you don't stop taunting me about unpreparedness, I'll just slap you on the wrist." And this limp-wristed, weak, effeminate British conscientious objector is simpering, "Oh, you naughty, unkind German, really, if you don't desist, I'll forget I have a conscience and I'll smack you on the wrist." These instantly recognizable negative stereotypes are also visible in this cartoon, drawn shortly after the war to show the impotence of the Paris Peace Conference, as the simpering police officer simply looks on as poor beleaguered Europe, about to be clubbed by Bolshevism, pleads, "Officer, call a real policeman." Any hint of transgenderism came in for special ridicule. Here it is used to lampoon environmentalists, showing John Muir in a dress, flowery bonnet, and apron, as he fruitlessly tries to sweep back the waters of progress that are flooding Hetch Hetchy Valley. And in 1912, the entire Republican leadership was rendered in drag, their inter-party squabbling depicted as a gossipy, backbiting ladies' tea party. If you want to make men ridiculous, present them as women. Again, assuming the inherent superiority of straight white men is certainly nothing new. In the Gilded Age, Native American culture was deemed so inferior that the nation entered into a period of forced assimilation under the slogan, "Kill the Indian to save the man." When some people wonder why, more than 150 years after the end of the Civil War, this country is so plagued by anti-Black racism, I think some of the ugly cartoons that promoted racism in the Gilded Age provide important answers. Here, we see why African American men should not be allowed to vote, as this monster is reaching out for white women. If allowed to vote, the Negro would crush the honest white man. The only solution? Get back. We will not stand it. And when African-American activist William Monroe Trotter met with Woodrow Wilson in the White House to protest Wilson's support for segregation in violation of his specific campaign promises to African Americans, here was the result: a powerful measure of the limits of Wilson's promise of new freedom. Anti-Black racism complicated the women's suffrage movement. The white South had successfully implemented a variety of ways to prevent African American men from voting, and feared that passage of the 19th Amendment would bring increased scrutiny. The third bullet point in this Georgia handbill, urging the defeat of women's suffrage, states their case plainly. Vote against women's suffrage because universal suffrage wipes out the disfranchisement of the Negro by state law. And the final bullet, white supremacy must be maintained. Mississippi Senator John Sharp Williams told Jeanette Rankin, the first woman elected to Congress and staunch advocate of the 19th Amendment, "If we passed your amendment, then Negro women would vote." She does not respond with a vigorous defense of the rights and equality of her Black sisters, asking instead, "But couldn't you keep them from voting the same way you keep the Negro man from voting?" As Carrie Chapman Catt put it to Congressman Edwin Webb of North Carolina in 1918, "If you want white supremacy, why not have it constitutionally, honorably? The federal amendment for women's suffrage offers the way." The African American women and men who had been working diligently on behalf of women's suffrage were unceremoniously thrown under the bus by their white sisters. Are there any positive lessons to be learned from this period of using American law and government to impose and enforce racism? I believe there are. First, African Americans fought back. establishing the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909, a lasting and significant leader in the fight to end racial inequality and structural racism. And then, as now, individuals took up the fight where they could. Belle La Follette, for example, refused to accept that the only way for women to win the vote was to curry favor with the racists of Congress, denying the rights of African Americans. Beginning in 1913, she wrote a series of searing articles decrying the actions of the Wilson administration to racially segregate federal services, extending even to streetcars. African-American leader Mary Church Terrell called the purging of Blacks from hard-earned positions in the federal government the most serious blow to Negro rights since the days of slavery. And Booker T. Washington observed that he had never seen African Americans in Washington, D.C. so discouraged and so bitter. And enraged Belle La Follette declared that merit, not sympathy, demands that Negroes should not be discriminated against and should be accorded the justice due them as citizens of a democracy. To have the United States government take a backward step, to have the color line drawn in places where they have won their merit, to be humiliated, repressed, and degraded at the capital of the nation by their own government, which has no right to discriminate among its citizens, is a body blow to hope and pride and incentive. The public needs to be aroused to the principles at stake. As La Follette denounced the injustice and violation of democratic principles imposed by the new orders, she skewered the hypocrisy of whites who supported segregation. It seems strange, she observed caustically, that the very ones who consider it a hardship to sit next to a colored person in a streetcar entrust their children to colored servants and eat food prepared by colored hands. La Follette called for agitation because the purges degrade our standards, corrupt our ideals, and destroy our sense of democracy. In 1914, she spoke at the colored YMCA on 12th Street in Washington, D.C. It was an electrifying event. La Follette offered not just performative outrage, but solutions. What can be done, she asked the enthusiastic crowd, to force public attention, secure a hearing, make the papers take notice? She called not for caution and discretion, but agitation and discussion, which lets in the light, clears the atmosphere. The race issue, like the suffrage question, the sex question, or any other perplexing, unsettled problem disturbing society today, should be freely and seriously discussed in private conversation, in the public, in the press, and from the pulpit. The situation does not call for violence, but it demands determination, loyalty, courage, persistence, unfaltering faith in well-directed efforts. Her efforts were reported on the front page of the Washington Post. She defends Negroes. Wife of Senator La Follette denounces segregation, says U.S. government errs. Her activism inspired others to join in the effort. As the ranks of the Washington branch of the newly formed NAACP swelled, President Wilson received hundreds of letters of complaint calling the discrimination harsh and humiliating, an insult and an outrage, and a violation of the spirit of the Constitution and opposed to the teachings of Jesus Christ. Lesson 4. Opposition can sting, but support is validating and provides much needed encouragement. One anonymous writer called Belle La Follette disgraceful to the white race and suggested the only true reason for her actions was that she was herself Black, but only, quote, a little light in color. It was signed, a real white person with no black stripes down the back like you. However, Ralph Tyler, an organizer for the National Negro Business League, wrote to La Follette that he had read her words, quote, each time with renewed inspiration and with renewed courage, because it clearly indicated to me that my race still has good, strong, and eminently fair white friends in this day of threatened segregation, just as we had in the dark days of subjugation before our emancipation. I thank you for your article, and I know I but voice the sentiment of my race in doing so. When La Follette was introduced to a predominantly Black audience in 1914 by Nanny Helen Burroughs as, quote, the successor of Harriet Beecher Stowe, lawyer James Hayes bowed his head and said, Amen. Speaking for his race, Hayes told La Follette, we thank God for such a white woman as you. We thank God for sending you to us, and we thank you for coming. A few more like you would awaken the sleeping conscience of the nation. I have presented her inspiring actions as an example of what white people can do to contribute to anti-racism in the present day. There are other inspirational lessons from the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Certainly it had its anti-vaxxers, and during the Great Flu epidemic, anti-maskers. But in the end, public health made great gains in this period, from educational campaigns about the dangers brought by flies and spitting, to the life-saving potential provided by taking protective measures against infectious diseases. And that recognition went hand in hand with investigation of the food and drug industries, known to be peddling palatable poisons. And this culminated in the creation of the Food and Drug Administration in 1906. There were some other surprising victories, vicious lies and propaganda campaigns notwithstanding. Images like this one were used to explain why women shouldn't vote. Their minds were completely taken up by fashion, chocolate, babies, and puppies. But as women's suffrage gained momentum, more serious tactics had to be employed. Women's suffrage and socialism go hand in hand. Women's suffrage means higher taxes. And yet, in the end, after decades of struggle and activism, women did achieve the vote. Lesson 5, promote peace. I've restricted this talk to domestic matters because I don't have the time or the strength to tackle the Trump world of foreign affairs, but I will say this. Prior to U.S. entry into World War I, Bob La Follette had warned, quote, war and rumors of war are a dreadful diversion for peoples demanding juster distribution of wealth. War is the money changer's opportunity and the social reformer's doom. He noted the hypocrisy of Americans as self-proclaimed, quote, custodians of peace and instructors in democratic ideals to less enlightened peoples, while their own nation continued to be plagued by serious problems of inequity, including poverty, racism, sexism, and political corruption. The filibuster La Follette organized to prevent U.S. entry into World War I electrified the nation. For his unflinching opposition to U.S. entry, La Follette was spat upon, hung in effigy, and made the subject of a congressional investigation. You don't even need to see his face to know who they're vilifying here. But socialist and labor leader Eugene V. Debs sent this telegram. Let the Wall Street wolves and their prostitute press howl. The people will sustain you, and history will vindicate you. And Debs was right. La Follette read into the congressional record excerpts from some of the 15,000 telegrams and letters he had received from people in 44 states. 9 out of 10 offered unqualified endorsement of his views. Said La Follette's oldest daughter, the war clamor and denunciation by the press were but a whisper in his ears compared to the voices which were calling to him throughout the country, strong and beautiful in their support. So, lesson 6, our leaders need to hear from us. Because our political leaders need us, we, the people, must be involved, must let our leaders know of our involvement. Students of mine who have interned for various representatives in Washington, D.C., say that constituent email is important. Once they receive a certain number of messages on an issue, they bring it to the attention of their senator or representative. So just because you don't get a response doesn't mean that you aren't making an impact. Email and donations aren't the only forms of engagement. Discussing political issues and candidates with friends and neighbors, writing letters to the editor, attending demonstrations, hosting an informational campaign party, and most importantly, simply paying attention to the issues and voting. All of these are the life's blood of politics. Your voice matters. Upon her death in 1931, Belle La Follette was hailed by the New York Times as, quote, perhaps the most influential of all American women who have had to do with public affairs in this country. And Bob La Follette left his imprint on the nation as well. I've drawn parallels to today in this talk because I get impatient with people who seem to think that because our present day problems are unprecedented, they can't be remedied and thus must just be accepted and endured. What if the La Follettes and the other progressives had taken that position in view of the unprecedented problems of their day? The La Follettes were part of a larger progressive reform movement that brought us lasting improvements that included national parks, as well as resource conservation. As Theodore Roosevelt has shown, keeping the lumber trust from clear-cutting a forest on U.S. public lands. They pioneered public health. Here it creates a wall, keeping children safe from the attack dogs of preventable disease. And they demonstrated how ostensibly powerless people could make an impact. Even before progressive women achieved the vote, they used their power as homemakers and shoppers to demand proper inspection of meat. They created settlement houses in every major city, where they helped recent immigrants learn how to navigate city life and apply for jobs and citizenship. There was meaningful downward tariff reform, and a graduated income tax was implemented. Workplaces, food and drugs were made safer. If you take a cruise today, you must take part in an emergency drill and know where your place in the lifeboat is. That is the direct result of La Follette's Seamen's Act, passed in 1915. To push it through, La Follette cited the recent Titanic disaster as proof that the lives of the poor were less valued, and he argued that all lives were worthy of equal protection. The progressives brought us the secret ballot, direct election of senators, workers' compensation, and paved the way for child labor laws. Women received the vote. Sometimes progress is like a glacier. The movement is imperceptible to the human eye, but meaningful change is occurring, and taking time to recognize even baby steps provides much needed incentive to carry on. Belle La Follette counseled both perseverance and patience, observing that, quote, all human progress is slow and difficult. It requires great faith and wide vision not to be discouraged in any earnest struggle for human betterment. To us in the rank and file, Robert La Follette counseled tenacity, hope, and courage. He knew how hard it could be. He emphasized during his many failed bids for office the need not to be debilitated by defeat. In politics, you cannot afford the luxury of bitterness or despair. No one ever said democracy is easy. In one of my favorite films, A League of Their Own, the star pitcher, played by Gina Davis, quits because she says it just got too hard. And her manager, played by Tom Hanks, says it's supposed to be hard. If it was easy, everyone would do it. It's the hard that makes it great. We are, said Bob La Follette, slow to realize that democracy is a life and involves continued struggle. It is only as those of each generation who love democracy resist with all their might the encroachment of its enemies, that the ideas of representative government can even be nearly approximated. I appeal to you, he said, young and old, plain citizens and politicians. You are confronted with a great responsibility. In this contest, you must either stand for representative government or against it. The fight is on. It will continue to victory. There will be no halt and no compromise. In other words, it's the hard that makes it great. So, our biggest foes are not the Donald Trumps of the world, nor their enthusiasts and enforcers, but their opponents who surrender to the siren song of despair, complacency, resignation, apathy, and perhaps the most dangerous and defeating of all, cynicism. In times like these, Fighting Bob counseled both immediate action and patience. It will not be possible, he said, to restore industrial and commercial freedom at once. Unrestrained lawless wealth in combination has run amok for a score of years until it so involved our entire industrial and commercial structure that to attempt to effect a radical and immediate cure would endanger the whole structure. But we must make a beginning. We must make a beginning at once if we were to avert disaster. Sometimes the progress may not be visible at all in the short term and requires a longer view. Much of the original progressive agenda, with its emphasis on federal regulation, found its way into the New Deal in the 1930s, including minimum wage and Social Security. Progressive notions of equality and the power of people championed by the La Follettes were evident in the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s, and in a variety of subsequent protest and reform efforts. The progressives had their failures, and they made many mistakes. For example, some were so racist and elitist that they were instrumental in creating the eugenics movement. It is also undeniable that many of their positive achievements, progressive remedies to the modern urban industrial society, did not last. Bob La Follette anticipated just such reversals of progressive gains and counseled hope rather than despair. Fighting Bob believed that, quote, democracy is safest when its entire citizenship is most enlightened, most interested, most alert. Near the end of his life, he ran as an independent in the presidential campaign of 1924, in which he garnered 17% of the vote. I will let him have the last word in a statement from that campaign that remains valid today. America is not made, but is in the making. It is an unending struggle to make and keep government representative. Mere passive citizenship is not enough. Men must be aggressive for what is right if government is to be saved from those who are aggressive for what is wrong. There is work for everyone. The field is large. It is a glorious service, this service for the country. Every American should count it a patriotic duty to build at least a part of his life into the life of his country, to do his share in the making of America. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much. Nancy, you can unshare your screen so people can see you. We've got time for a handful of questions. And the first thing that someone asked is, these are amazing graphics and illustrations. And given that there was concern about control of the press and censorship, where did you find all these?
Well, that's a great question. And I have to say, I've been teaching at the college level for 40 years. And one of the greatest things that ever happened to me was the internet and all of these amazing images. So if you're thinking, I need a political cartoon on, immigration, you go into, you put in political cartoon and boom, they come up. And some of them are pretty poor, but many of them are from the Library of Congress and they're beautifully reproduced. So it's just something that I have collected over the years because we all know, particularly in teaching, you can talk about these abstract ideas and it's it's kind of hard to grasp, but a good cartoon or an image can really make things, so that you can understand what they're doing. That first one of Rockefeller, saying what a funny little government. I mean, it says it all. So I'm glad that they're enjoying these images, because I just love them, and I love any opportunity to show them.
Well, that's great. And we remind everybody, put your questions in the Q&A and I will try to put them together and pose them. One of our persons was particularly interested in how the use of words was a challenge. And, Black became a euphemism for foreigners, for Germans, and then what people began to say and think about the anti-Hispanic sentiment in the context of public health. What would you like to say about the use of words as, real challenges for this?
I think that is an excellent question. And I would have to say that, and this is not exactly an original observation, but I think in the present day, conservatives, Republicans are winning the words war. They are using words, I think, much more effectively than liberals and Democrats are. And so I think that words really matter, and word choice really matters. And I think that this is something that that I have to hand it to the Republicans for coming up with certain phrases and ways of doing things that have taken over. And I think this is an area where there needs to be a lot more work and recognition of the power of words. Words that, I think that for better or for worse, Americans are often not really eager to take on nuance and difficulty and so forth. And so finding words that are clear, that really capture an idea, this is absolutely key, and something that I think needs to be used much more effectively.
I think it's also important to note that in this context that, some of the sort of traditional Republican Democrat, though it moves between parties, the origin of the Republican Party as really the, standing against slavery as part of their component. So there's a lot of, none of these conversations can be isolated to be, this is a Republican problem, this is a Democratic problem. It's an American challenge of trying to meet our more perfect union where we really are all engaged. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
go on.
let me kind of give you one last, we're coming up on our time. And so I want to, if you can, you've given a brilliant analysis of sort of the some of the parallels and some of what was going on at the time. What would you say are there significant differences that we might, notice that say, okay, things were different in the following way, and that we ought to take that into consideration?
I think there are many differences. You can't just say, "Oh, we're in a new Gilded Age," and we're seeing, as you said, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. I think that there are this. I didn't say. The challenges of the Gilded Age progressive era were unprecedented. The challenges I think we're facing as a nation today are also unprecedented, many in very, very different ways. That as an American historian, it is so many of, for example, so many of the images that I showed today were, showing the power of Congress, and that we had these corrupt people, and money was really, running Congress and so forth. I'm hard pressed to think of any president who has taken this kind of action before. So I can't really say, oh, well, we just need to learn the lessons from the past and apply them to the present. And I think it's dangerous to kind of start saying, well, this is a complete parallel and this isn't. I think that and I know this sounds a little rah and flag waving, but when you're talking about, we're all Americans and we want to move towards this more perfect union, I think the thing that does unify this, that where there are the real parallels, is that people cannot be complacent. If you are really in support of what's going on today, then you need to say that and give your support. If you are not, you need to say that, and you need to say why. I think that we really, one of the things that I really admire about the progressives and that little speech of Bob La Follette's at the end is two things. One, that he reminds us that democracy is not easy and it is constantly being remade, and that it is up to we the people. We the people are the ones who ultimately are, do have to have influence, let our voices be heard, and that actually does matter. And I think that I just can't say that enough.
Well, Dr. Unger, we are so grateful for all that you have provided and all that has made us think. And so we could talk about this for all day, but we won't do that. Instead, we'll talk about some of the upcoming events. And so this is the moment where we're going to share the screen. And again, as always, we thank you for your support of the United States Capitol Historical Society that allows us to bring these kind of lectures to you. We are grateful, Dr. Unger, that you donated your time and your talent to be with us. And we have several upcoming fascinating conversations coming up next week. Dying for McCarthy's Sins is the story of the suicide of Wyoming Senator Lester Hunt. An untold story that we offer for your thoughts and think about it. Then in April 10th, we talk about the life of Lucretia Mott, who was a suffragist and abolitionist. And then we talk about the civil service system and Garfield on April 17th. Each of these are stories from our history that are important stories to understand our history, but important stories to understand what's going on today, because the issues continue to come forth as we try to build this more perfect union. The United States Capitol Historical Society is chartered to tell our story of the Capitol, the people who work in it, and we are grateful to each of you who make your contributions to make it possible. We exist by virtue of the donations of our members and friends and supporters. So please keep those cards and letters coming. We're grateful for your contributions, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you very much. Be well.